The Architecture of Authority, a diagnostic analysis of divine governance from Noah to Moses. In this study, we examine how God structured human authority across two critical Old Testament administrations, exploring not just what these systems were, but why they were designed the way they were, and what they reveal about the nature of divine governance itself. Slide 2. The failure of internal conscience. Before the flood, God governed humanity primarily through the conscience, an internal moral compass embedded in every human being. But conscience alone proved insufficient. Without external accountability, human behavior descended into unchecked violence and moral chaos. The pre-flood world demonstrated a critical lesson. Internal restraint, by itself, cannot sustain a just society. People require external structures of accountability to function within God's design. This failure of conscience set the stage for a dramatic shift in how God would govern his creation. Slide 3. The Noahic Mandate. Following the flood, God established a groundbreaking covenant with Noah, one that fundamentally changed the structure of human society. For the first time, God delegated governing authority directly to humanity. This is the Noahic Mandate. At its core, the Noahic Mandate gave human beings the right to rule, specifically the authority to enforce justice through what theologians call the sword of the magistrate. Capital punishment for murder was established as a recognition of the sanctity of human life made in God's image. This external restraint was God's direct response to the failure of conscience. Government was not a human invention. It was a divine institution. Slide 4. The scope of Noahic governance. The authority granted under the Noahic Mandate was remarkable in its breadth. Unlike later covenants that would focus on a specific nation or people group, Noahic governance was universal in scope, applying to all of humanity, from individuals to families, communities, and entire civilizations. The jurisdiction extended across every human being descended from Noah, which is to say, every person on earth. The justification for this authority was grounded in the image of God, the imago Dei. Because every human being bears God's image, the taking of human life carries divine weight, and therefore requires divinely sanctioned accountability. This universal mandate laid the foundation for all subsequent human governance structures. Slide 5. From universal to specialized. The shift from Noah to Moses. For centuries, the Noahic framework governed humanity as a whole. But God's redemptive strategy was not static. As history progressed, a dramatic tactical shift took place, from governing all nations universally to raising up a single specialized nation. This was the birth of Israel under the Mosaic Covenant. Where Noahic governance was broad and applicable to every people group, the Mosaic administration was narrow and particular, designed specifically for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God was no longer simply restraining evil across the globe. He was now constructing a showcase nation, a kingdom of priests that would reveal his character and prepare the world for the ultimate solution, the Messiah. Slide 6. The Kingdom Code. The 10 Commandments. At the heart of the Mosaic administration lay the 10 Commandments, what we might call the Kingdom Code. These were not arbitrary rules, but a carefully structured legal framework divided into two distinct pillars. The first pillar governed the vertical relationship between Israel and God, defining how the people were to worship, honor, and relate to Yahweh. The second pillar governed horizontal relationships, how Israelites were to treat one another within their community. This dual structure reflected a comprehensive theocratic vision, a society where both spiritual devotion and social justice were legislated and enforced. The Ten Commandments were not merely moral guidelines. They were the constitutional foundation of a nation under divine rule. Slide 7. Noahic versus Mosaic. Two distinct administrations. A critical question arises. Was the Mosaic Law simply an extension of Noahic governance, or were these two entirely separate systems? The answer, as the text makes clear, is that they are distinct administrations with fundamentally different purposes. Noahic governance was universal, permanent, and focused on the restraint of evil through civil authority. The Mosaic Law was particular, temporary, and focused on the revelation of sin and the preparation of a covenant people. The Mosaic Law did not replace the Noahic framework. It operated alongside it, serving a unique redemptive function that was never part of the Noahic Covenant. Understanding this distinction is essential to correctly interpreting Old Testament law and its relationship to the New Covenant. Slide 8. The purpose of the Mosaic Law. If the Mosaic Law was not primarily about civil governance, then what was its purpose? The answer is both profound and precise. The Mosaic Law was designed to transform abstract sin into specific, measurable offenses. Before the law, sin existed, but it lacked legal definition. Paul writes in Romans that sin is not counted where there is no law. The Mosaic Law provided that definition. It named specific behaviors as violations of God's standard, making transgression clear, concrete, and accountable. In this sense, the law functioned like a diagnostic instrument, not to cure sin, but to identify it. It was a mirror that showed humanity its true moral condition, creating the need for a remedy that the law itself could never provide. Slide 9. The principle of delegation. One of the most significant features of Old Testament governance was its hierarchical structure of delegation. God did not govern his people through a single human ruler. Instead, he established a layered system of authority that distributed governance across multiple levels. At the top was Yahweh himself, the ultimate sovereign. Below him, authority was delegated to judges, then to leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. This structure, first implemented under Moses following the Council of Jethro, reflected a scalable and decentralized model of administration. Each layer was accountable to the one above it, and ultimately all layers were accountable to God. This principle of delegation is foundational to biblical governance theory and has shaped political philosophy throughout history. Slide 10. The balance of submission and rebellion. At the heart of Israel's covenantal relationship with God was a constant tension, the choice between submission to Yahweh and the pull toward rebellion and idolatry. This was not merely a spiritual struggle. It had direct governance implications. When Israel submitted to Yahweh, the covenant blessings flowed: peace, prosperity, military victory, and national cohesion. When Israel drifted into idolatry, the covenant curses followed: invasion, famine, exile, and collapse. The scales of Old Testament governance were therefore not just political, they were theological. The stability of the nation was directly tied to its fidelity to God. This dynamic illustrates a principle that runs throughout Scripture. Delegated authority only functions rightly when it remains submitted to the one who delegated it. Slide 11. The flaws of delegated rule by mortal men. As Israel's history unfolded, a sobering reality became undeniable. Human beings, no matter how carefully structured the system, are flawed intermediaries. The judges failed, the kings failed, the priests failed. Even the most faithful leaders, Moses, David, Solomon, ultimately demonstrated the limitations of mortal governance. This is not a pessimistic observation. It is a diagnostic one. The Old Testament governance systems were never intended to be the final solution. They were, as Paul would later write, a guardian, a temporary custodian to lead humanity toward something better. The rust on the gears of human governance pointed inevitably to the need for a ruler who would never fail, never compromise, and never sin. The imperfection of mortal rule was itself part of the divine plan, building the case for a perfect king. Slide 12. The removal of delegated authority. God as all in all. The final slide brings us to the ultimate destination of God's governance architecture. All the scaffolding of human government, the Noahic Mandate, the Mosaic Law, the kings, the priests, the judges, was always temporary. It was constructed for a purpose, and when that purpose is fulfilled, it will be removed. Paul describes this climactic moment in 1 Corinthians 15. When Christ has put all enemies under his feet, and the last enemy, death, is destroyed, he will hand the kingdom back to the Father so that God may be all in all. Every system of delegated authority that God established in the Old Testament was pointing toward this. Not the permanence of human governance, but its ultimate dissolution in the fullness of direct divine rule. The architecture of authority was never the final building. It was the scaffolding around the one that is eternal.